My name is Takashi and I was 17 years old in the summer of 1945. I lived in Hiroshima with my family. My father, a factory worker who labored long hours to provide for us. My mother, who kept our small home in order, and my little sister Emmy, who was only 8, full of laughter and mischief. Our family was ordinary, modest, like countless others in the city, yet in those days, ordinary life felt fragile, overshadowed by the unending war. I spent my days at school walking through streets already marked by ration lines, blackouts, and air raid drills. I loved reading sketching scenes of the city as I imagined them before the war, and sharing quiet moments with my friends who were as anxious as I was about the future. My world was small, bounded by the school walls, our neighborhood streets, and the warmth of my family's presence. Yet I felt the tension in every glance, every distant roar of airplanes overhead. Though I had no desire for heroism or battle, the war shadow reached into every corner of my life. I kept a diary scribbling thoughts and dreams I feared might vanish, thoughts of becoming a teacher one day, of helping my community rebuild, and of keeping Emmy safe. I clung to these small hopes, unaware that the very streets I walked would soon be engulfed in a firestorm that would test every ounce of courage and resilience I possessed. Hiroshima in the summer of 1945 was a city of contrast, ordinary life intertwined with the heavy shadow of war. The streets I walked every day were lined with ration lines, the weary faces of neighbors carrying the weight of scarcity. Shops were empty and faster than supplies could arrive, and the radio constantly reminded us of the war's relentless reach. I remembered the tension in the air, a mixture of fear, fatigue, and the faint glimmer of hope that life might one day return to normal. Even in school, the presence of war was undeniable. We had drills to practice air raid precautions, and teachers urged us to memorize instructions for seeking shelter. Some classrooms had windows blackened to prevent detection from enemy aircraft, and whispers of bombings in other cities circulated among the students. Despite all this, life continued. I listened to my friends talk about small joys, family meals, sketches, stolen moments of laughter, but underlying every conversation was the knowledge that Hiroshima, like so many other cities, could be destroyed in an instant. Families like mine tried to maintain routines. My father returned home exhausted, carrying the invisible burden of factories operating under pressure to support the military. My mother managed our home with care rationing rice and other essentials while offering Emmy and me a semblance of normalcy. In the evenings, the streets were quieter, punctuated by the distant hum of airplanes, and I often paused to look at the skyline, imagining what life might look like if the war ended tomorrow. Yet, even as we clung to these small routines, rumors of a new kind of bomb reached us. They spoke of unimaginable destruction, of a weapon capable of flattening a city in moments. I could not fully grasp the scale of what was being whispered, but I felt it in my bones, a foreboding sense that the life I knew, the streets I wandered, the laughter of my sister could all vanish in a single incomprehensible flash. This tension, the fragile normalcy against the looming invisible threat, formed the backdrop of my life. Every day was a mix of ordinary schoolwork, fleeting joys, and the quiet anxiety that something beyond our control would soon change everything. It was a morning like any other yet. An uneasy feeling hung in the air. From my bedroom window, I watched the sky with a mixture of curiosity and dread. The horizon seemed oddly bright, and the distant hum of aircraft stirred whispers among the neighbors. Children who usually ran through the streets now walked silently, glancing upward as if expecting the clouds themselves to fall upon us. I could feel my pulse quicken. News had reached us about a new bomb, though no one knew its full power. Adults spoke in hushed tones, fearful of being overheard. My father's jaw tightened when he discussed the possibility of another raid, and my mother's hand shook as she packed what little rice we had for the day. Emmy clung to my side, unaware of the gravity, her small fingers tracing the seam of my sleeve. I tried to comfort her, but inside I felt the first true taste of fear, the kind that grips you in the pit of your stomach, leaving you unsure whether to run or stay. Even as I walked to school, the streets seemed transformed. The usual chatter of friends and vendors had given way to silence broken only by the occasional siren or the far-off rumble of engines. Shadows stretched across the buildings in strange, distorted shapes, and the scent of smoke from distant fires lingered in the warm air. I scribbled in my diary, attempting to capture the day's tension, writing about the sunlight glinting off rooftops, the worried eyes of strangers, and the strange sense that life as we knew it was about to end. I did not yet understand what awaited us, only that something immense and terrible was approaching. My thoughts returned to my family, to the small joys that had defined our ordinary life. Emmy's laughter, my mother's cooking, my father's quiet reassurances. Could any of it survive the coming storm? I felt an overwhelming need to record everything, as if writing could somehow preserve our lives, our memories before the unthinkable struck. In that moment, a sense of foreboding settled over me, a silent acknowledgement that the world I knew could vanish in a single blinding instant. The streets, the buildings, the people I loved, all could be consumed by fire and shadow. And yet amid the fear, a flicker of determination arose to survive, to bear witness, and to carry the story of Hiroshima forward, even if everything else were lost. Life in Hiroshima during those final months of the war was a fragile balance between routine and fear. Each morning, I walked the familiar streets to school-passing neighbors who carried the weary expressions of people, stretched thin by ration lines and endless uncertainty. Shops displayed empty shelves, and the scent of burning charcoal from makeshift cooking fires mixed with the acrid tang of smoke drifting from distant air raid drills. Even the sunlight seemed heavier, casting long shadows that seemed to warn of dangers we could not yet see. At school, the presence of war was inescapable. Teachers reminded us constantly of air raid precautions, and the classrooms were lined with blackout curtains to hide us from the skies. Drills interrupted lessons, and every siren or distant rumble of an aircraft caused a collective tension to ripple through the students. We tried to laugh, to study, to behave as if the world were normal, but the underlying anxiety never fully faded. My friends exchanged nervous smiles and hushed whispers about ration shortages, rumored bombings, and the latest reports from other cities. I scribbled these thoughts in my diary, trying to preserve the fleeting moments of normalcy before the shadow of destruction reached us. At home, my father returned from the factory exhausted, his hands calloused and smeared with grease, carrying the invisible weight of Japan's war effort. My mother managed our household with quiet determination, rationing what little rice we had, preparing meals that barely satisfied our hunger, and offering Emmy and me moments of comfort amid the tension. Evenings were a mix of routine and vigilance, listening to the radio for warnings, checking the streets for unusual activity, and comforting neighbors who were equally anxious. Despite the fear, there were moments of beauty and resilience. Children ran through alleys when the air was clear, laughter ringing out briefly before the distant drone of engines reminded us of the fragile thread by which our lives hung. I found solace in sketching the cityscape as it was that summer, rooftops the gentle curve of the river, the ordinary streets that seemed to hold 1,000 untold stories. Every day I clung to these glimpses of peace, aware that the life we knew might vanish in an instant, and determined to remember it should the worst come to pass. As the days passed, a quiet tension settled over Hiroshima, creeping into every corner of our lives. I found myself staring out the window more often, watching the skies for any sign of aircraft, each hum or distant roar making my heart race. Rumors about a new bomb had reached the city, whispered in markets, schools, and homes. No one fully understood its magnitude, yet the fear in people's eyes spoke volumes. It was a terror I could not name, a shadow looming over even the most ordinary moments. I began to write more diligently in my diary, trying to capture not just the events of the day, but the thoughts swirling inside me. I wrote about my hopes to survive, to protect Emmy, to see my parents safe. I wrote about my dreams, simple ones, finishing school, walking through the streets without fear, tasting my mother's freshly cooked rice. Each word felt like a tether, a fragile link to a world that might soon vanish. The adults around me behaved as though they understood more than they let on. My father spoke cautiously, offering advice on how to seek shelter, how to stay calm if alarm sounded. My mother's quiet glances and tightened lips conveyed worry far beyond what she dared to say aloud. Even my friends seemed to sense that something unimaginable was approaching. Their laughter grew more forced, their games shorter, as if each passing moment was borrowed time. Inside me, the conflict was constant. I wanted to be brave, to act normally, to pretend that Hiroshima was still the city I had always known. Yet a part of me trembled with a sense of foreboding I could not shake. The diary became my refuge, a place to name my fear, to confront it on paper when it seemed impossible to do so aloud. I realized that the challenge ahead was not just survival, it was the preparation of my mind, the gathering of courage to face a day unlike any other, a day that could obliterate the world I had always taken for granted. That morning, the city seemed deceptively calm, as if it were holding its breath. I kissed Emmy on the forehead before leaving our small home, her tiny hands gripping mine with a trust I longed to protect. My mother pressed a bowl of rice into my hands, her eyes wet but determined, whispering reminders to be careful, to listen to the alarms, and to watch over my sister. My father's grip was firm, his callous hands holding mine longer than usual, silently conveying the gravity of what might come. Walking to school, I noticed the unusual quiet. The streets were alive yet subdued. Neighbors exchanged brief nods instead of words, their faces etched with tension. My friends greeted me with nervous smiles, laughter forced and fleeting, as if daring to pretend that nothing had changed. We shared hurried conversations about trivial things, homework, chores, hopes for summer, while each of us secretly feared the unknown. Even in those brief interactions, I felt the fragility of our lives. Every hug, every smile, every whispered joke was a delicate thread connecting us to a normalcy that could vanish in an instant. I recorded these moments in my diary, trying to capture the essence of a day that, unbeknownst to us, would be remembered not for its routines, but for the catastrophe that would soon erupt. As I walked the final stretch to school, I glanced back at my family. The sight of my mother and Emmy standing in the doorway, my father's stern yet worried gaze, etched itself into my memory. There was a silent understanding between us, a recognition that life might never be the same again. And as I stepped forward, clutching my books and my unease, I carried with me not only my own fear, but the collective hope of my family and friends, however fragile it might be. The day felt heavier than usual, the air thick with the quiet tension of a city waiting for something unknown. My first responsibility, though unspoken, was to keep Emmy safe. Even as a 17-year-old, I felt the weight of being her protector, a role I had never formally held, but one that now defined every thought. Each step I took through the familiar streets of Hiroshima reminded me that ordinary routines were suddenly filled with extraordinary stakes. At school, small tasks became acts of vigilance. I reminded my classmates to follow blackout precautions, help younger students check their shelters, and offered reassurance with as much calm as I could muster. The teachers, tired and weary, relied on us to maintain a semblance of order, passing down the sense of duty that had been impressed upon them by the city's perilous reality. I listened to their instructions carefully, understanding that these drills and routines were more than procedures, they were lifelines, the difference between survival and disaster. Back at home, I helped my mother with preparations for potential raids, moving furniture to create safe spaces, checking our emergency supplies, and ensuring Emmy had water and food within reach. I learned to read the signs in the sky, the distant drone of engines, the shadows of clouds that seemed to move too fast, and to anticipate the signals that might demand immediate action. Every glance at my family reminded me of why these tasks mattered. It was no longer about chores or school assignments, but about preserving life. Even as fear pressed against me, a sense of purpose emerged. The responsibility of protecting those around me, of maintaining calm in moments when panic threatened, gave me a strange confidence. I realized that the days ahead would test more than just physical endurance. They would demand courage, quick thinking, and an unwavering commitment to those who depended on me. It was my first true lesson in leadership, in the quiet heroism of simply doing what must be done when the world teeters on the edge of catastrophe. The streets of Hiroshima, though familiar, had taken on a new weight. Every neighbor, every friend seemed to move with cautious purpose, their steps measured as though even a single misstep might summon disaster. I found myself drawn into the subtle networks of care that bound us together, sharing what little food we had, checking in on those who lived alone, offering words of encouragement where I could. It was a strange comfort, this fragile solidarity, a reminder that even amid looming uncertainty, human connection endured. At school, we banded together like soldiers on a minor front. I helped classmates carry water, showed younger students how to reinforce their makeshift shelters, and listened as my peers exchanged whispered concerns about their families. Each shared story, each quiet gesture became a testament to resilience. We laughed when we could not out of joy, but as an act of defiance against the tension that pressed down upon us. Every smile was fleeting, yet it held meaning, proof that hope, however small, was still alive. Even outside the walls of school, I noticed the ways in which adults worked together. My father assisted neighbors with repairs, my mother traded supplies with other families, and street vendors offered what little they could spare without a word of complaint. These small acts, often overlooked, impressed upon me the idea that survival was never just an individual effort. It was communal, requiring attentiveness, empathy, and courage. I recorded these observations in my diary, noting the sounds of whispered conversations, the faint laughter of children playing despite fear, and the shared determination that seemed to ripple quietly through the city. Each encounter reinforced a lesson I was beginning to understand. In moments of extreme uncertainty, our humanity is revealed not through grand gestures, but through the quiet care we offer one another, the small acts that stitch together a fragile sense of normalcy. The morning air was deceptively still, yet an invisible tension hummed through the streets of Hiroshima. Every shadow seemed sharper, every distant sound amplified. I walked cautiously, my eyes scanning the sky for any hint of aircraft, while my ears caught the faint, irregular drone that set my heart racing. It was a sound I had learned to recognize, one that often preceded panic and hurried drills, but today it felt different, more ominous, as if the city itself held its breath. Neighbors moved quietly, their faces taut with concern. Children clung to parents, their usual chatter replaced by nervous glances and hesitant footsteps. I noticed the trembling hands of shopkeepers arranging what little food remained, and the tense posture of soldiers and civil defense volunteers practicing drills as if bracing for a storm that was already coming. Even the river reflected an unusual stillness, its surface calm yet foreboding, mirroring the anxious undercurrent that ran through the city. I felt an unsettling mix of fear and anticipation. My diary, which had become both a confidant and a lifeline, sat heavy in my satchel, begging to be opened. I scribbled quick notes capturing the strangeness of the morning, the sharp glint of sunlight on rooftops, the sudden hush that fell over the streets, the distant roar that sent shivers through my spine. Every instinct screamed that something extraordinary and terrifying was about to occur. My thoughts returned to Emmy and my parents. Would we have time to react? Could any of the preparations my father and I had made possibly be enough? The questions circled relentlessly, each one answered only by the tightening knot of dread in my stomach. I knew that the life I had known, the laughter of friends, the routines of school, the comforting presence of my family was on the verge of vanishing, and I was powerless to stop it. In those tense, fleeting moments, I realized the fragile line between normalcy and catastrophe. The city, my friends, my family, and I were all suspended above an abyss we could barely comprehend. I clutched my diary tighter, promising myself that I would record everything, that if survival was granted, these pages would bear witness to the ordinary lives that had existed just before the unimaginable descended. And in that promise, I found a flicker of resolve, a determination to endure, to observe, and to survive, no matter what was coming. I had been walking to school that morning when the sky suddenly seemed to ignite. One instant the world was familiar, the streets lined with vendors, the river glinting in the early sunlight, children running to class, and the next a blinding flash tore through the sky, searing into my eyes with a brilliance I could scarcely comprehend. For a heartbeat, I thought it was the sun itself, impossibly close and unbearably bright. Then came the sound, not a roar, but a shock wave that seemed to pass through everything at once, rattling bones, walls, and hearts. The ground beneath me trembled violently, and I was thrown forward, my arms flailing as debris rained down around me. Buildings once solid and familiar crumbled into clouds of dust and flame. I remember the smell, immediately acrid metallic, choking a smoke so thick it clawed at my throat and stung my eyes. Panic gripped everyone. Screams erupted raw and unending, mingling with the thunder of collapsing rooftops and the crackle of fire. I tried to move, but my legs felt like lead, my vision blurred by smoke and the glare of the inferno. Around me, people ran blindly, tripping over rubble, some disappearing beneath walls that had once protected them. I clutched at Emmy's hand in my imagination, wishing desperately that she were there, safe and unharmed. Time itself seemed to stretch and fracture. Seconds became eternities, each heartbeat a countdown I could not control. My ears rang with the reverberations, and my mind oscillated between disbelief and sheer terror. Everything I had known, the routine streets, the laughter of my friends, the comforting presence of my family, was obliterated in a moment. It was a violence that defied understanding, a force that made human scale meaningless. Amid the chaos, a strange clarity surfaced. My diary, forgotten in my satchel, became a symbol of survival. Even as I scrambled through dust, fire, and screams, I thought about recording every detail, every sensation, every fleeting glimpse of human fear and courage. I realized then that surviving was not enough. Bearing witness was a responsibility as weighty as life itself. By the time the initial shock subsided, Hiroshima had transformed into a nightmare of ruin. Flames licked the sky, black smoke twisted into unnatural shapes, and the city once alive with ordinary life now lay in a surreal tableau of destruction. I stood, trembling heart hammering, breathing through the acrid haze, aware that nothing would ever be the same again. And in that moment, I vowed silently that I would endure, that I would remember, and that I would tell the story of the world I had lost. When the initial shock passed, the city that had been my home was unrecognizable. Streets I had walked 100 times were now a landscape of rubble-jagged beams and shattered walls. Smoke rose in thick black plumes curling into the sky and blotting out the Sunday. A strange, eerie stillness lingered between the chaos broken only by distant cries and the intermittent crackling of fires that devoured everything in their path. I stumbled through the ruins, my eyes stinging from ash and dust. The ground was uneven, littered with the remains of buildings, personal belongings, and heartbreakingly, the bodies of neighbors and friends. Some were motionless, others groaning in pain, their clothes tattered and burned. The air was thick with the scent of scorched earth, charred timber, and a metallic tang that I would never forget. Each step brought a new horror, a new face, etched with suffering, a reminder that the world I had known had been violently erased. Panic and grief swept through me in waves. I called out for Emmy, for my parents, for friends whose names I shouted into the smoke and fire. My voice felt small against the enormity of the destruction. Survivors moved in a dazed trance, some carrying the wounded, others stumbling blindly, their faces pale and eyes wide with disbelief. I saw people whose bodies were scarred beyond recognition, their skin blistered, hair singed, and clothes reduced to rags. The sheer scale of loss was overwhelming, and I felt a paralyzing mix of terror and guilt. I had survived, but at what cost? I found myself crouched beneath the remains of a collapsed building, trying to make sense of what had happened. My hands were scratched and bleeding, my clothes burned, but I could still move. Around me, cries of anguish echoed, mingling with the distant roar of flames and the falling debris from weakened structures. I realized that survival required more than fleeing. It demanded quick-thinking resilience and, above all, the will to keep moving despite the horror surrounding me. Even in the midst of despair, small acts of humanity emerged. Strangers helped one another out of rubble, shared water and bandages, and guided the injured toward whatever shelter they could find. I joined in, instinctively helping a woman lift her child from the ruins, offering water to a man whose lips were cracked and bleeding. In these fleeting moments, I understood the fragility and resilience of human life, how swiftly it could be shattered, and yet how stubbornly it clung to hope. As I moved forward through the devastated streets, I made a silent vow to record every detail in my diary to bear witness to the horror, the bravery, and the suffering. Hiroshima had become a city of ghosts and fire, but it was also a city of stories that needed to be remembered. And in that vow, I found a fragile sense of purpose amidst the ruins. The streets of Hiroshima were no longer streets. They were a labyrinth of ruin and ash. Every step I took felt uncertain. The ground beneath me shifted and crumbled as if the city itself were rejecting our presence. Smoke and dust clung to my lungs, stinging with every breath, while the distant roar of collapsing buildings reminded me that the disaster was far from over. My clothes were tattered, my skin burned in places, and yet I had to keep moving. Survival demanded it. I stumbled over shattered beams and cracked concrete, my eyes straining through the haze to identify safe paths. Occasionally I saw survivors, some crawling, some limping, others carried by strangers who themselves were barely standing. We exchanged brief, frightened glances, silent acknowledgments of shared desperation. Words felt inadequate in the face of so much horror. Gestures, a hand extended, a nod, a lifted debris board spoke more than any sentence could. Water was scarce, and thirst gnawed at me relentlessly. I scavenged what I could from broken stores, abandoned homes, and overturned carts, drinking sparingly, knowing that I had to preserve strength for the journey ahead. Flames licked nearby buildings, sending waves of heat that forced me to divert paths and slow my pace. Everywhere I looked, the city's familiar features had been distorted, turned into jagged silhouettes against a sky still choked with smoke. In this chaotic march, I encountered strangers. Some were injured beyond my ability to help, others were desperate for guidance. Instinctively, I helped a woman hoist her child onto my back, guiding them to a partially sheltered street corner. I offered water from my small ration to a man whose lips were cracked and eyes hollow with shock. The fear was palpable in everyone, yet beneath it, I glimpsed something remarkable, the raw will to live. Even amid ruin, people reached out to one another, forming fragile bonds of survival. Time became elastic. Minutes stretched into hours as I navigated the devastation. I clutched my diary tightly in my satchel, aware that these moments of terror, of fleeting compassion, of sheer endurance needed to be remembered. Each act of survival, each small choice to help or keep moving was a testament to human resilience. My legs burned, my lungs burned, but with each step I reminded myself to survive was not only to continue breathing, but to witness, to endure, and to bear the weight of Hiroshima's story. By nightfall, I found a relatively sheltered spot beneath the remnants of a collapsed building. I rested briefly, ears alert to every distant cry and collapse. In that tenuous refuge, I reflected on the journey so far, on the lives lost, on the courage of strangers, and on the fragile thread that kept me alive. I knew the struggle was far from over, but I also knew that I could not give up. Survival was a responsibility, a duty, and the first step toward bearing witness to the unimaginable. The more I moved through the devastated city, the more I realized the staggering scale of what had been lost. Houses where neighbors had lived for generations were reduced to ashes and rubble. Streets where children had once played freely were now littered with the remnants of their toys, scorched and unrecognizable. Everywhere I looked, I saw faces twisted in agony or frozen in disbelief. Some were familiar. Classmates, neighbors, friends whose laughter I could still hear in memory. Many were gone, swallowed by the firestorm in an instant. I came across the bodies of people I had known, friends, from school shopkeepers who had smiled at me every morning, even acquaintances I barely spoke to. The sight was unbearable. Some were unrecognizable, their skin blistered, their clothes burned away, lying in positions that made my stomach turn. I wanted to scream, to run, to cry, but there was no time, no safe place to grieve. Survival demanded that I push forward even as my heart shattered with every step. The most agonizing part was the absence of my family. Emmy, my little sister, had been so full of life, I could not find her among the ruins. My parents were nowhere in sight. The streets seemed to mock me with their silence, broken only by the distant cries of those still trapped or wounded. Each unanswered call, each empty space where a loved one should be tightened, a knot of despair in my chest. I felt a strange, piercing guilt. Why had I survived when so many others had not? Yet even in the depths of grief, I saw glimpses of courage. Strangers lifted the injured from the debris, forming impromptu chains of help. Some carried buckets of water, others wrapped scorched bodies with torn cloth. I joined them when I could, helping a woman lift her child from the rubble and guiding an elderly man to a temporary shelter. Each act of assistance was fleeting and fragile, but it reminded me that in the midst of unbearable loss, humanity persisted. As night fell, I found a small, partially sheltered corner to rest my body aching and my spirit heavy with sorrow. I opened my diary and wrote not to lessen the pain, but to preserve it, to bear witness. Each word became a testament to those who had vanished and to the fragile thread of survival that still held me. The city was a tableau of ruin and grief, yet I clung to the faintest flicker of hope that by enduring I could honor those lost and tell their story, ensuring that Hiroshima's tragedy would not be forgotten. The city itself had become an enemy, reshaping every familiar landmark into a perilous landscape. Smoke hung thick in the air, turning the morning light into a dim orange haze. The scent of burning wood and scorched earth clung to everything, stinging my nostrils and scratching at my throat. The heat from distant fires licked at my skin, raw and tender from the burns I had already suffered. Every inhalation reminded me of my vulnerability, of the fragile boundary between life and death. Debris was everywhere, splintered beams, shattered glass, jagged pieces of metal, and the remnants of buildings that had once sheltered families, shops, and schools. Walking required constant vigilance. One wrong step could send me sprawling into hidden dangers. The ground beneath me was unstable, shifting beneath my weight as I maneuvered through piles of rubble. Occasionally, the skeleton of a collapsed structure would creak ominously, threatening to give way at any moment. My body ached in ways I could barely describe. Small burns blistered along my arms, and face clothing fused to raw skin in places, while cuts and scrapes from broken glass and sharp debris reminded me with every movement that survival was costly. My muscles screamed with fatigue from hours of walking and climbing through ruined streets. My lungs burned with each breath of thick, acrid smoke, yet I could not stop moving. Stopping meant vulnerability. Moving meant endurance. The city sounds were surreal. The wind carried distant cries, the groans of the injured, and the occasional crash of collapsing ruins. Amid this chaos, I noticed the subtle signs of life, faint shouts of guidance, the rustle of makeshift shelters, the splashing of water as survivors helped each other. Even here, amidst physical devastation, the human instinct to survive manifested in small, quiet ways. I paused briefly, leaning against the remains of a wall for support, closing my eyes to collect myself. The injuries, the heat, the dust, they pressed down upon me like a weight I could not lift. Yet beneath the exhaustion, beneath the pain, there was clarity. Each sensation, each scar was evidence of survival, a testament to the physical cost of witnessing Hiroshima's horror. My diary rested in my hand, a fragile anchor ready to capture every detail of the physical and environmental terror surrounding me. Even in the wreckage, I understood one truth: the body could endure, the mind could endure, and through careful observation and relentless movement, survival was possible. But each step came with the stark reminder that the world as I had known it had been irrevocably altered. As I navigated the ruins, the enormity of what had happened began to settle into my consciousness. Hiroshima was no longer the city I had known. It was a testament to human destruction, a landscape that had been erased in an instant by a force I could barely comprehend. The blinding flash, the heat, the roar, and the smoke had left their mark not only on the city but on my understanding of life itself. I thought of the people I had lost, friends, neighbors, perhaps even my own family, and the suddenness with which everything I had known, had been swept away. The realization was both humbling and terrifying. A single moment could redefine existence, leaving devastation where once there had been normalcy, joy, and routine. In that awareness, I felt the weight of human power. The capacity for creation had been eclipsed by the capacity for annihilation. Yet amidst despair, a change was stirring within me. Seeing survivors cling to one another, offering water, shelter, or a simple reassuring hand reminded me that even in the face of incomprehensible horror, human kindness persisted. The instinct to protect, to comfort, to rebuild was stronger than any weapon. I began to understand that courage did not reside in the absence of fear, but in the determination to act despite it. The bombing forced a shift in my perspective on war itself. Before, war had seemed abstract, something distant spoken of in lessons or newspapers, a background to our daily lives. Now its consequences were tangible, immediate, and devastating. I saw that conflict, when amplified by human ingenuity in destructive forms, could obliterate entire communities, shatter lives, and leave scars on both the land and the soul. Peace, I realized, was not merely the absence of conflict, but the deliberate cultivation of empathy, understanding, and the preservation of life. I resolved in those early days amid the ruins to bear witness. My diary became more than a record of events. It became a testament, a vessel for the lessons I had learned through suffering. Every observation, every feeling of fear, grief, and fleeting hope would be preserved so that the world might understand the true cost of unchecked human destruction. Through this act of remembrance, I discovered a fragile but enduring sense of purpose. Survival was not merely living, it was learning, reflecting, and striving to ensure that such devastation would never be repeated. Amid the ruins, I realized that survival alone was not enough. The city of Hiroshima had been transformed into a silent testimony of destruction, and I, one of the few who had lived through the inferno, carried the responsibility of remembering. My diary, once a repository of ordinary thoughts and schoolboy worries, had become a vessel for truth, a chronicle of the unimaginable, a record for those who could not speak. I wrote feverishly, documenting everything I could recall: the blinding flash that had burned the skyline, the roar of collapsing buildings, the scent of smoke and scorched flesh, the twisted forms of those who had perished. Every detail mattered. I wanted the world to understand not just the scale of the disaster, but the human experience within it, the terror, the confusion, the moments of fleeting courage, and the quiet acts of compassion that shone through even in the darkest hour. Meeting other survivors, I listened to their stories and shared my own, forming an unspoken network of remembrance. Each tale, whether of loss, resilience, or sheer chance, added depth to the collective memory we were preserving. We were not merely recounting events. We were constructing a tapestry of lived experience, a record that carried the weight of those who could not tell their own stories. In the evenings, I would sit among the ruins, listening to the distant crackle of fires, the murmurs of the wounded, and the subtle stirrings of life persisting in pockets of shelter. My pen moved across the pages, capturing the juxtaposition of horror and humanity, despair and determination. I understood that history often forgets the individual amidst the grand scale of events, but through these words, I could ensure that the personal truths, the fear, the grief, the courage were never erased. Bearing witness became a mission, one that transcended survival. It was a vow to speak for the absent, to give voice to the lost, and to remind those who might one day read these pages of the fragility and value of life. Hiroshima had shown me the depths of human suffering, but it had also revealed the resilience, the empathy, and the enduring will to live. And through the act of recording, of remembering, I found a purpose beyond mere existence to ensure that the story of that day and the lessons it carried would echo through time. In the days that followed, the exhaustion settled into my bones. It was not only the physical fatigue from walking through the ruins or helping others, but a deeper, heavier weariness that clung to my mind. Sleep was fragmented, haunted by vivid nightmares of fire and smoke of streets collapsing beneath my feet of faces frozen in terror. Each time I closed my eyes, the city flashed before me in a kaleidoscope of destruction, and I awoke drenched in sweat, heart pounding as if the disaster were still unfolding around me. The psychological weight was compounded by the relentless reminders of loss. Every crumbling building, every scorched tree, every distant moan of the wounded reminded me of the fragility of life. I carried survivor's guilt with me, a persistent ache in my chest. Why had I lived when so many others had not? I thought of friends, neighbors, and perhaps my own family members, and the question gnawed at me constantly. My diary became my only refuge, a place to pour out the fear, the grief, and the helplessness that threatened to overwhelm me. Yet even amid despair, there were moments that reminded me of the resilience of the human spirit. Small acts of kindness from strangers, the quiet determination of fellow survivors, and the tentative connections we forged in the shadows of devastation offered glimmers of hope. These moments did not erase the pain, but they gave me the strength to move forward step by step through a city that seemed to be breathing its sorrow into every corner. I realized that trauma was not something that could be hurriedly escaped or ignored. It needed acknowledgement, reflection, and endurance. The fatigue that weighed upon me was a testament to survival itself, a signal that my mind and body had witnessed horrors beyond comprehension and that recovery, both physical and emotional, would be a gradual, painstaking process. And so I pressed on, holding tight to my diary, trying to make sense of my new reality and searching for fragments of purpose in the midst of overwhelming loss. The physical toll of surviving Hiroshima was relentless. My body bore the evidence of the city's devastation, blisters from burns, cuts and scrapes from jagged debris, muscles aching from hours of climbing over rubble and helping the injured. Each movement reminded me of my vulnerability, of how easily life could be ended and how tenuous the line between survival and death truly was. Simple tasks became monumental challenges. Walking through the streets required constant vigilance. A misstep could lead to further injury on shattered concrete or twisted metal. Drinking water was a careful process, rationed and scavenged from unsafe sources, each sip carrying the risk of contamination. Food was scarce, and what little I found did not always provide the strength needed to keep moving. Every day was a battle against exhaustion, dehydration, and hunger, as well as the lingering effects of the burns and injuries that had been sustained during the bombing. Radiation sickness began to reveal itself in subtle, then undeniable ways. I felt waves of nausea and dizziness. My skin became more sensitive and hair started to fall in thin patches. The burns that had blistered early on refused to heal quickly, leaving raw, painful reminders of the day the bomb fell. My body, though alive, was weakened, and each task, even lifting debris to help someone else, required extraordinary effort. Despite the pain and fatigue, I had to adapt. I learned to pace myself, to rest when possible, and to conserve what energy I had for critical moments. The survivors around me faced similar struggles. Their injuries varied but equally severe, and together we navigated the precarious balance between survival and collapse. The physical consequences were a daily, inescapable reality, shaping our movements, our choices, and our ability to help one another. Through it all, I recorded my injuries and experiences in my diary, knowing that the full story of Hiroshima's aftermath could not be told without acknowledging the suffering endured by the body as well as the mind. Survival was not merely the act of living. It was the relentless struggle to endure the scars, visible and invisible, that the disaster had carved into every aspect of our lives. In the days following the bombing, survival was no longer a matter of instinct alone. It demanded constant decision-making, often between equally unbearable options. Each choice carried weight, forcing me to weigh my own safety against the needs of others. The rubble-strewn streets were full of injured survivors, many too weak to move themselves, and every step forward demanded a calculation: whom could I help without endangering myself, and when would discretion take precedence over compassion? I remember one particular moment vividly. A woman lay trapped beneath a collapsed beam, her cries piercing through the surrounding chaos. My first impulse was to rush to her side to lift the debris and free her. But as I approached, I noticed the unstable wall above creaking ominously, threatening to collapse with the slightest disturbance. In that instant, I realized that attempting the rescue could mean my own death, leaving no one to survive for her. The choice tore at me: save one life and risk another, or retreat and preserve the fragile thread of my own survival. I hesitated, heart pounding, before reluctantly stepping back, forcing myself to accept the grim logic of survival. These moments repeated themselves countless times. Each decision was a negotiation between empathy and pragmatism, a strategic compromise that I had never imagined I would be forced to make. I learned to prioritize help, those who could be moved with minimal risk, find temporary safety for those stranded, and conserve my energy for the long, uncertain journey ahead. The act of choosing became a constant, exhausting mental burden, one that carried its own emotional scars. Even in retreat, I carried guilt, sorrow, and a profound sense of moral conflict. Yet I also began to recognize a harsh truth: survival did not always align with instinctive morality. Enduring the disaster required acknowledging limits, calculating risks, and sometimes making decisions that would haunt me long after the fires had faded. Through it all, my diary served as both witness and conscience. I recorded each choice, each compromise, and the reasoning behind it, knowing that these decisions, though painful, were integral to the story of survival. They were proof that enduring Hiroshima demanded not only physical resilience, but also the courage to navigate the impossible moral terrain left in the wake of destruction. As the initial chaos began to subside, I realized that survival alone was not enough. The city was a landscape of ruin, yet pockets of life persisted. The cries of the wounded and the bewildered reminded me that my responsibilities extended beyond myself. I could no longer focus solely on my own safety. Others depended on me as much as I depended on them. Slowly, I shifted from mere survival to active participation in the small acts that sustained our fractured community. I began by helping wherever I could. I guided children through streets strewn with debris, carrying water and sharing whatever food had been scavenged. I assisted the injured, steadying those who could not walk, and helped create makeshift shelters from broken beams and tarps. Each action was exhausting, yet it gave purpose to my fatigue, transforming fear and despair into practical, life-saving engagement. In these moments, I realized that even amidst catastrophe, human solidarity could thrive. Collaboration became essential. Survivors formed impromptu teams, coordinating efforts to clear rubble, locate supplies, and protect the most vulnerable. I learned to read the dynamics of these small groups: who could carry the heaviest loads, who needed support, who could calm panicked children. Leadership in this context was quiet and fluid. It required attentiveness, empathy, and adaptability. I discovered that contributing to collective survival was both a strategy and a moral imperative. At night, we gathered in partially sheltered areas, sharing stories, comforting one another, and planning the next day's efforts. The shared labor and mutual support began to create a fragile sense of community amidst devastation. Through these experiences, I understood that rebuilding was not only about structures and supplies, but about sustaining hope, nurturing trust, and preserving dignity in the face of loss. As I documented these days in my diary, I reflected on the shift within myself. The fear that had dominated the first hours of survival had been tempered by purpose. My focus had expanded from mere self-preservation to caring for others, understanding that resilience was intertwined with compassion. This realization marked a turning point. Survival now included responsibility, and responsibility required courage, empathy, and the willingness to act in a world that had been irrevocably changed. Amid the ruins of Hiroshima, I began to understand the profound cost of conflict. The city's streets, once vibrant and familiar, were now a stark reminder of how fragile life could be and how quickly human ambition could spiral into destruction. Each scar on the landscape, each burn on a survivor's body, and every story of loss whispered the same lesson. Peace is not simply the absence of war. It is the conscious preservation of life, the active cultivation of empathy, and the steadfast rejection of hatred. I reflected on my own survival and the responsibilities it entailed. Living through the disaster meant more than enduring pain and hunger. It carried an obligation to remember to bear witness and to share the truth of what had happened. My diary became more than a personal record. It became a testament to the lives that had been lost, to the courage of those who helped others, and to the stark consequences of human conflict. Through my words, I sought to give voice to those who could not speak, ensuring that their suffering and bravery would not vanish into silence. The experience reshaped my perspective on humanity. I realized that the choices we make both as individuals and as societies carry immense consequences. The act of surviving required more than instinct. It demanded reflection, compassion, and a commitment to principles that transcend immediate self-interest. I understood that my role extended beyond mere survival. I had to contribute to the restoration of community, to foster understanding, and to advocate for peace in whatever small ways I could. Even in moments of despair, I saw hope emerging from acts of kindness and solidarity. Survivors shared what little they had, strangers helped one another navigate the dangers in quiet gestures, handing water, guiding a child, comforting a grieving neighbor, spoke louder than any words could. These experiences taught me that resilience is inseparable from empathy, and that sustaining life in the aftermath of tragedy requires both courage and moral clarity. As I continued to write in my diary, I made a silent vow to carry these lessons forward, to honor those lost by living deliberately, and to remind others of the true cost of war. Hiroshima had shown me the depths of human suffering, but it had also revealed the potential for compassion, courage, and responsible action. In embracing these truths, I began to envision a life shaped by reflection, purpose, and an unwavering commitment to peace. The smoke had long begun to clear, but the scars of Hiroshima were etched deeply into the city and into me. I walked among the remnants of streets I had known all my life, now unrecognizable, littered with debris and the silent echoes of lives that had been abruptly extinguished. Each step was heavy with memory. Each corner held a shadow of what once was. I had survived, but survival came with a weight that no one could lighten. In the days that followed, I found myself drawn to those who remained, helping wherever I could, clearing rubble, fetching water, offering comfort to children who had lost everything. The act of rebuilding, even in small ways, gave structure to my fractured mind and a sense of purpose amid the chaos. It was here, among the ruins and the quiet resilience of the survivors, that I began to reconcile with the magnitude of what had occurred. Emotionally, I felt a complex mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief that I had lived to see another day, to help others, to bear witness. Sorrow for friends, neighbors, and perhaps family members who would never walk these streets again. The city had changed irrevocably, and I knew I would carry its memory and the memory of those lost for the rest of my life. Though the war had ended, its echoes would remain within me. I understood that the act of living was intertwined with remembrance. Walking through Hiroshima amidst the fragile structures and emerging life, I felt the first faint stirrings of acceptance, a recognition that while the past could not be undone, my survival granted me the responsibility to ensure its lessons would endure. Even as Hiroshima slowly began to breathe again, I felt the lingering weight of the disaster etched into my body and mind. My burns had healed in part, but scars remained, raw reminders of the heat and destruction that had consumed the city. Fatigue clung to my muscles and my body ached constantly, a persistent echo of the hours spent fleeing, climbing, and helping others. Even simple tasks, walking, lifting debris, carrying water, felt heavier than before each movement, a negotiation with my weakened strength. The psychological impact was no less relentless. Nights were haunted by vivid nightmares of fire and smoke, of streets collapsing and faces contorted in terror. Anxiety shadowed every day. Even the smallest sudden sound would send my heart racing, triggering memories I could not silence. Survivor's guilt was a constant companion. I questioned why I had lived while so many perished, and the faces of friends, neighbors, and perhaps family members remained forever etched in my mind. Yet, life demanded adaptation. I learned to navigate the remnants of the city carefully, to conserve energy, and to manage the lingering pain that threatened to overwhelm me. My diary became a sanctuary, a place to release grief, catalog injuries, and reflect on the fragility of human existence. Each written word was an attempt to process trauma and assert a measure of control over a reality that had once spiraled beyond comprehension. In those long days and sleepless nights, I understood that survival extended beyond the body. It required tending to the mind, confronting pain, and finding ways to carry forward despite scars both visible and invisible. Living meant enduring, remembering, and striving to rebuild in a world forever changed. In the aftermath of Hiroshima, I came to understand the profound responsibility that survival carries. The city's ruins were not just reminders of destruction, but of lives interrupted, of potential unfulfilled, and of the immense cost of human conflict. Each scar on the landscape, each story of suffering spoke to the necessity of valuing peace not as an abstract ideal, but as a commitment to safeguarding life, dignity, and hope. I reflected on the sacrifices of countless individuals, those who had perished instantly, those who had endured pain silently, and those who had acted with courage to help others amidst chaos. Their actions, small and large, left an imprint on my consciousness, teaching me that human resilience is inseparable from compassion and moral courage. To survive was not merely to continue breathing, but to honor these sacrifices through purposeful living. This understanding shaped my sense of responsibility. I felt compelled to bear witness, to record and share the truth of Hiroshima so that the lessons of devastation would not be forgotten. Every page of my diary became a testament to the consequences of unchecked power, the value of human life, and the ethical imperative to cultivate empathy and understanding. In contemplating peace, sacrifice, and responsibility, I realized that the act of living is intertwined with remembrance. To survive is to hold the past in awareness, to act consciously in the present, and to contribute toward a future in which such horrors might never be repeated. Hiroshima taught me that peace is not given. It is a commitment nurtured by the choices we make and the stories we tell. Walking through the remnants of Hiroshima, I felt the weight of history pressing against me. The city was slowly awakening from its nightmare, yet every charred wall, every scorched tree, every ruined building carried the echoes of lives that had been irrevocably altered. The streets whispered memories I could never forget, and the faces of those I had loved, lost, or helped lingered in my mind, inseparable from the ruins themselves. In the quiet moments, I opened my diary and reflected on the journey I had endured. Each page bore witness not only to the horrors of that day, but also to the resilience, courage, and humanity that persisted amidst destruction. I understood that the story of Hiroshima was not merely one of tragedy, but also a testament to the enduring spirit of those who survived, who helped one another, and who bore witness to the unimaginable. As sunlight pierced through the lingering smoke, illuminating patches of green, reclaiming the ruins, I felt a fragile hope. The city would rebuild and life would continue, but the memories, the lessons, and the sacrifices must endure in the hearts and minds of those who lived through it. My survival had given me a responsibility to remember, to share, and to honor those who could not. Hiroshima taught me the fragility of life, the consequences of human conflict, and the importance of empathy, courage, and remembrance. And so as I closed my diary and walked along the quiet streets, I carried both the weight of loss and the spark of hope, knowing that these memories, though born of fire and suffering, would forever guide my understanding of humanity, peace, the preciousness of every life.